the sisters, are able to establish this dialogue while their respective husbands are unable to. I think that, I don't want to go into cliches or anything like that, but I think that the woman's voice in this novel is part of the key to the success of this poetics, of reconciliation. I don't think that a male author or male protagonist or in a male voice, I don't think that the message would have the same impact, the same effect, the same frankness that it does. So I'm very happy that we're having this dialogue. I do have a couple of questions for Uva, and of course you'll be able to ask her some questions as well afterwards. The first question, Uva, is how much of the Memory of Silence is autobiographical?
I don't know how to put a percentage of it, but the Lauri, the character who lives here, many things are autobiographical. She leaves Cuba the same day I left Cuba. I had to make her a little older than me because she's already married and I left at 15, so I made her leave at 18. But for example, she lives in Miami at the beginning of Exile. I never lived in Miami at the beginning of Exile. But I interview a lot of people who did, so it not only some of it is autobiographical, but it also has, I stole pieces from other people's life. And for example, she goes to Columbus, Ohio, which I've never been to Columbus, Ohio, but my sister did. So she told me about the prison there and how Exile was there in Columbus. So it has, and of course all the historical events that happened in the civil rights movement, the assassination of Kennedy, all the Vietnam War. There is a character who's killed in Vietnam. I have a cousin, the same age, the description of how he's killed, the date he was born, that's all true. So the character here has a lot of things that are autobiographical and some not. The husband is not my ex-husband. He didn't go to Bay of Pigs. He wasn't, a rapist, The character of the father-in-law has a lot of my own father. The character of the grandmother has a lot of my own grandmother. And then I think that the most challenging part for me was the parts that are not autobiographical, and especially building the character of Menchu, the sister who lives in Cuba. And I went to Cuba for the first time for a week while I was writing the novel. But, the novel spans for 40 years. So even if I went for a week, that doesn't help me, describe the life of a person for 40 years. And I wrote to a lot of people while I was, thank God for emails. For example, at some point I decided that somebody was going to have dengue, so I wrote to 4 or 5 people, who got dengue, how did they cure it, where did they go, how was the hospital. At some point I decided they were going to go to the Soviet Union. So again, I wrote to people I knew had been in the Soviet Union, because I can read a lot about the Soviet Union, but how was it for Cubans? So many other things, I just asked people, so that's why I was able, people are surprised, especially in Cuba, that without my living there, I've been able to reconstruct the daily life. And it's because I asked a lot of people. I have a friend who was here when I was writing the chapter of the La Zafra del 70, the cotton cane campaign in 97, he wrote the 10 million tons. And I asked him, who went, what time did you get up, how was, every little detail. So for all the interviews I did and all the emails, writers never really invent anything. It's like cubism. You have a reality, you decompose it, and you recompose it in a different way. So that's what I did. I took from my life, from everybody, other people's life, and I recomposed it.
I think that everybody who's Cuban. Everybody who's an immigrant who has been away from their families will identify with this novel in a very personal way. So we probably find bits of autobiographies of our own autobiographies in it.
I went to a book club that my oldest daughter organized a couple weeks ago. There was no Cubans. All the young women were from Ecuador, one from Mexico, one from Venezuela, and they identified with the novel so much. And they were not exiles. They were immigrants, but they had many of the same feelings. That'd be pretty cool.
I had the opportunity to moderate the question and answer session after one of the presentations of the play back in November, no? In October at the Kuwait Center. And at the end of the question and answer session, this gentleman came up and started really berating the actor who had played the miliciano arrepentido, you know, the army guy in Cuba who was pro-revolution and who was having second thoughts, and he was a very complex character. But the gentleman from the audience had failed to make the distinction between the actor and the real person. And how can you do that? And the guy said, listen, I'm just acting. And the guy was even Venezuelan, the whole cast, actors.
And in Venezuela, the play has been very successful. They're doing now in April again, and they've been very successful. The critics have been very good because they're going through the same thing.
They can identify.
They can identify. Yes.
Uba, given the emotional and often polarizing topic of Cuba, what is the function of dialogue in the novel? And what other approaches do you use to transcend the political differences and reach into our shared human condition?
I'm very glad you asked that question because I think the dialogue is key in the novel in many ways. First, the dialogue between the characters, and especially chapter 12 when they are in Miami and they confront each other after they have read each other's diaries, and they clarify some misunderstandings and they confront each other and so forth. That's to me the key of it. I work very, very hard in developing the voice of the characters, and not only of the two main characters, but even the secondary characters. And Lázaro specifically, the pro-revolutionary, was the most difficult for me to develop. And what I did is, I would come here to the library and I would spend, at the beginning of each chapter, looking at the magazines for that day and making copies of things so that I would see the things that were happening in the country, and especially the revolutionary language that he would be using, because he was official. But there's a dialogue of, people when they talk. And when I finished the novel, I read each character, everything they said, even the smallest characters, to make sure that their voices were. And I think that even secondary characters like the mother, for example, that maybe doesn't talk that often, but by the few things she says, So the dialogue is important also because I think it makes the story go faster for the people, just not hearing the descriptions of the narrative, but hear the dialogue. But also, the novel itself is a dialogue because you have two sisters that are writing a diary and they're writing it for each other. So the chapters are alternating their voices, so the voices are a dialogue all the time. And then there's another layer of dialogue, which is the dialogue of the characters within themselves. They ask themselves questions, they doubt themselves, they remember. They dream, they're as they talking to their sisters, because writing these diaries for their sisters, and so often they address them, they're also asking themselves things. And that's why in the last chapter the voices alternate. I mean, so far it's been in chapter one voice, but the last chapters, they're both voices at a point in which they almost seem the same voice. So dialogue is key, and I'm very glad you brought up the theme about the gender, and that it would not have been. Well, there's still another layer of dialogue, which is the dialogue between history with a capital H and history of, well, in Spanish decimos la historia de las muchachas, but well, the stories of their lives, you know, everyday history, or the intrahistoria, because you have these newspaper clippings with the big history, the big events. Sometimes their lives are in contradiction to the official story, and there's an irony there, which, you know, it's for the reader to see. But the fact that they're women is not only because I'm a woman. It's because, and the fact that the men are dead when they meet. I adore men. I don't mean to kill them at all.
They often die.
But, well, so the woman, and there's some that died in you know, the grandmother and the mother-in-law. The women also die in the book, because it spans 40 years, people have to die. But, and before I wrote the novel, I wrote an essay called El Caimán ante el Espejo about the Cuban identity. And one of the things is in Cuba's, I mean, authors usually have 4 or 5 ideas, and we repeat you know, them all through our lives, you know. And one of the ideas in that book was the polarization in Cuban society, in Cuban folk. We think about machismo as, you know, how it affects relationship with the men and women, or how it affects women because we get paid less than men or so. But we don't think often about machismo, how it affects the political culture. And in Cuba, it has affected our political culture, and in Latin America, and that's why it is raised to caudillismo. But it's not only caudillismo, it's a polarization of societies. It's this thing, and Octavio Paz explains it very well. You know, these things about I'm always right, and not, it's not meant to say I'm wrong, and Luis Aguilar said, you know, that humans say, we don't say, oh, I disagree, or I see another point. We say, estás absolutamente equivocado. You're absolutely wrong. So I think that for Cuba to reconcile, it's not that men have to die, but it's that polarization of society, which represented by the 2 husbands, has to die before we can really reconciliate. And some people don't like the word dialogue and the word reconciliation. But I always say, my mom used to ask me every month in her latter years to help her reconcile her bank account. And I would sit with her, and you know, we would go over it. And sometimes there was a small difference, and we would go over it, and we would find it. And there were $3 or $4 difference, but I said, no, let's just adjust it. So that's what reconciliation is. You go over things, you see, you know, what you add, what you subtract, and sometimes with some small difference, you adjust it, and you go on. And we humans have to adjust our differences and go on at some point, because we cannot go fighting for the rest of the life, and certainly we cannot give the next generations our burdens, our polarization. We have to give them a future in which they can work together. And if this novel, even in a small way, helps that, then, you know, I would be more than happy.
Thank you. I think that in the novel, the dialogue runs really deep, because you get the feeling that each character is really speaking independently of the author, because they each have very different points of view, and you can see them and you can understand each one, even though they disagree. So it's not the case, as unfortunately has been the case many times in literature, where the characters become talking heads for the author. In this case, they are really independent characters, independent point of views, very real point of views that are shared by people that you meet, and that individuality is respected. It's never you know, one character is never given the upper hand in the argument over the other character, because they each have valid points. Now I remember in the 80s, to talk about dialogue, particularly in the city, was very problematic. I remember there were bombs, there were assassination attempts, some of them successful, there were beatings, there was censorship, and a number of things in the 1980s regarding the difficult word dialogue in terms of Cuba. At that point, it was a dialogue between Cubans from the exile community with dialogues with people from inside Cuba, particularly with the government, basically. And it was very much rejected, very violently sometimes, by a sector of the Cuban American population. They have their reasons, I don't agree with their methods, but nevertheless it was a fact. It was a fact, and it was, I think, a dark chapter in Cuban American history that I think we have overcome at the present point. But, you know, thinking about the 1980s and 1999, when you wrote the novel, 2002 when it was published, do you think that the time was right for this kind of novel then? I mean, what would you think would have happened if you had published it in the 80s?
I couldn't have published in the 80s because I didn't think like I did in 99. I couldn't have written it in the 80s. Actually, I was not in favor of that dialogue, and I wrote against it. So, and I'm honest to say it. And actually, I gathered a group of people in my kitchen, and we went to Paris and had a congress to try to show the world that things in Cuba, you know, were still very bad. And so I think I myself have a proof of how things have evolved in the community, and it's not because at all I think that the Cuban government is, you know, good or hasn't done a lot of harm or does not disrespect human rights, which I have fought for many times. It's because it has to stop at some point. We have to find new methods of bringing change, which are not violent. So I don't think I could have written in 1980. I did not get any negative feedback in 2002, but I think that this rebirth that it has had now shows it that maybe now it's more its time than it was. Maybe it was a little bit ahead of the time when it came out. Even though I honestly did not have any negative criticism, I had very positive criticism, and it sold well, and I have many emails and letters of people who read it and enjoyed it and so forth. But now it's really, and the play and everything, it's having a rebirth, and I think it's because the time is right. Even the fact that it came out about the same time as Obama's. You know, I used to tell him but he was translating and he felt sorry because it took so long and so forth, and my sister also was pushing him and everything. I said, it would come out at the right time. And he did.
It sure did. But I know that the translation took a lot longer. I'm sure that it was not, you know, taking advantage of the news and...
No, he went to his own place.
Yeah. That's not how you translate a work like this. And the importance of translation is tremendous. I mean, we were seeing that the reception that the novel and then the play had in Venezuela, where people speak the same language and are able to identify. But the truth of the matter is that there is an interest on this topic worldwide. Like Professor Milbauer was telling us in terms of exile literature and many other topics that are touched upon here. Just the week before last, I was translating for a journalistic crew from Finnish television, from Finland. They were interviewing a Cuban family here that was a split family. Part of the family was here, recent arrival in Miami. The rest of the family was in Cuba. There is very much interest, they told me, in Finland on the Cuban situation, the family situation, and so on and so forth. And of course, you know, they knew about Uva and about her novel, so the translation now makes it possible for it to have an international readership. So it's really a great gift that translator Jeffrey Barnett is giving us. He's professor of Romance languages and serves as the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program head at Washington and Lee University, like I said before. I have a couple of questions for Jeffrey that hopefully would allow him the freedom to tell us about the craft of translation, particularly as it relates to this novel. Before we started the session, we were just commenting about the difficulties of translation, how truly difficult a job it is, how important a job it is, and how creative in a critical way it is. So, Jeffrey, the translator's task is often a compromise between the author's intentions and the reader's need to understand and relate to the work. And yet, here is a novel full of Cubanismos and rich colloquialism that need somehow to be made accessible to an English readership. What type of translational difficulties do you encounter in your work, and how did you approach them?
Many difficulties. No, and actually, some of the things that have been said so far that are the very strengths of the novel, which served Uva well, became my problems. But to step back a moment, you know, if we took the poem you read on exile and put it in Google Translator, we know what we'd get, right? You know, if this is done successfully, the aspiration of any translator is to be absent, to be seamless, to not know that you're reading that translation. And for the most part, if you stop and think of, Uva's heard me say this before, but for most of us, the very first works we read were probably works in translation. We read the Bible, we read the Greek fables, and we forget often that we're reading works in translation. Literature in translation is a vital part of our life. And then we become negotiators, where we take this original, we have to render it into what the translators call the black box. We take the original, we put it here, we let it regurgitate, and hopefully it comes out on the other side as this new original, this creative work that is paradoxically a new creation. And what we do, before I talk about the specific Goanismos, in any work we approach, it sounds easy, but it's not. We have two big monsters that we have to deal with. What words are we going to use and what order are we going to put them in? That sounds easy, it sounds like a mechanic, right? But I couldn't build a car. With literary translation then, let's take that word order, syntax. The different word order, I can change the tone, I can change the stress, I can change if somebody's mad just by the word order. But then finally, that word, that special word, the semantics, what word are you going to choose? That's where I would pace back and forth and I'd call it one and say, I don't like this word. And let me give you one example that I always think about in this work. When Vidal is singing Los Gavilanes, here's an aria. Of all things, here's an aria I had to translate. And the original, the Spanish is the phrase of bello cielo. Well, you think I can translate that as beautiful sky, but of course it's not. Beautiful sky sounds like something a meteorologist or a weatherman would say. It's not blue sky, it's blue firmament, right? So you have to find the register of what is evocative of the original. That's very difficult in this work, as you can already imagine, some of what we talked about, some of these issues of reality. I'll get you in a second. In the same aria, he uses the word aldea. Well, if you translate that as village, that has negative connotations, aldea. But if you talk about hamlet, then this is something more evocative, more poetic. So, you know, well, this may be apocryphal, I hear this often, I can't verify, but we talk about in the Real Academia that there are 40,000 lexical terms, in the Oxford English that there are 400,000 English terms. So you've got this huge register that you have to pull from, and you have to know, what does this word mean now? By the way, what did it mean in 1959? What does it mean in 2000? So we're already dealing with some of the things that any translator would have to deal with in any work, semantics and syntax. But let me move to typical professorial speak. I'll put these in categories. When we talk about Guanismos, first of all, there's certain things that are not idiosyncratic to the island that one would then want to leave as they were. When you see mija here, I think almost anybody would recognize that today. How silly would that sound if I'd said, my daughter, go, it's not going to work. So, you know,
Maybe.
yeah, you have to also then ask who is reading this in your North American audience and what might he or she recognize. But then moving to the juicy regionalisms. There are many things that if I had not had Uva's phone number, or I had the internet where I could look at images, or I have Diccionario de Guanismo Actual, there'd be things that would have been very difficult. Others that the difficulty that are very common, the problem was how was I going to explain that to North American audience? Let me start with some regionalisms. And a translator, you feel like you're a judge, you sustain and you overrule things. Let me talk about the ones that you just overrule. And here's a word that you think, man, this is, I've got to substitute something. And something's become very easy. I remember calling you saying, how's a quincalla? It's not in my vocabulary. I don't know what a quincalla was. It's a store. I think we ended up putting general store, a hardware store. It was a very easy substitution of one for one. Another one. In the Spanish that I learned in Honduras, we never use the word pitusa. Now, what's bad about that one, she very quickly told me it's jeans. See, okay, the bad thing about that one, I think it's the 9th word in the novel. She's probably thinking, what have I got into? This guy's he's gonna be on the phone day and night if he can't get past the 9th word in the novel. Pitusa. Those are very easy. Those are overruled. You substitute A for B and you move on. Now let me talk about some of the ones that are sustained in. There's a very beautiful passage in the 5th chapter where Enchu's describing the Mogotes. She looks at them in the countryside. I did not know the word Mogotes. It's not in my topographical or geographical vocabulary. I very quickly, I think, Googled them, and the phrase in Spanish, the literal translation would be, she looks out and sees the Mogotes that are tethered together like a herd of elephants. Well, when you look at Mogotes, they look like a herd of elephants. But how am I going to then convey that to somebody in Iowa? Well, that's a very easy trick translation. We simply use inference and interjection, where we'll say, I think in this case I said, the rounded dome-like hills, the Mogotes look like. So you leave that, but you, as a parenthetical for interjection. An easier one to talk about interjection. You would think we would all know what a guajiro is, but again, you don't know what your North American English audience will recognize. But that's a word that you have to leave in the text, but you also have to self-define it. And of course, we all know, right, that publishers will never allow footnotes and so in that case, it was just according to the peasants, or guajiros as we call them. So if you notice in the bilingual edition, the English version is probably about 15 to 20 pages longer than the Spanish, because I had to add, because I had to add things through interjection, inference, things that well, yeah. One thing that, and of course, here's some more that were regionalisms. The first time I went to Cuba was in 2000, and the first time I'd ever reading, what is this word, jinetiando? Oh my. And then when you start realizing jineta, jinetiando, you get this image of the prostitution and what is meant by the jinete. Well, in one passage it says, everybody's got their hands in the tourist pockets these days in some type of, que están bizneando. Well, I had to take an Anglicism, bizneando, and retranslate it back into the English and I said biznando, and then inference or some other type of business, or business, some form of business, or jineteando. Well, at that point, I'm thinking, how am I going to get this notion that jineteando is prostitution? And that took probably at least a clause there, I think, where I ended up saying, what a euphemism, a new word for referring to the world's oldest profession. And I had played with the new and the old. And so there were many times like that where I knew I was not going to be able to put a footnote. At that time, we didn't know if it was going to be a critical edition, if we would have a glossary. So there was certain little interjections when these are words that would not be recognized outside of Cuba. I'd add that even in the Spanish version, there is a glossary in the back in the Spanish. So there are quennies there that somebody outside of Cuba is not going to recognize. It was not, however, just regional vocabulary that gives it certainly a flavor and makes it idiosyncratic, but it was much beyond that. Let's go to another level that I consider historical. Well, this is still something idiosyncratic to Cuba, but that doesn't mean that somebody in Cuba in 2015 would recognize a certain word, because it's, after all, a historical novel. I was translating along and I came across this reference to cachucha. I thought, I don't even know if that's an adjective, a verb. What is a cachucha? And you do a quick internet search and you come across these YouTubes and I thought, God, I have never seen this zany woman, and of course from a North American perspective, thinking, God, this is sort of the Lucille Ball of the moment. And of course then you forget one reason it takes too long to translate, because now I'm no longer translating, I'm watching YouTubes, right, rather than translating. But how then can I, to a North American reader, not familiar with the Caribbean, not familiar with Cuba, not even familiar with that era, right, and that's the problem. How do I get Cachucha, this actress, identified? And in that case, it was Menchu, Laurie Menchu. You're speaking as if you were Cachucha, and she says, oh, I hadn't thought about her, and then I had to add, and that TV show in years, just to let the North American reader, okay, this must be some type of actress. And let's face it, you also don't want to hit somebody over the head saying, by the way, this is the zany actress from 1950. You have to leave the same ambiguity that is intended in the original. The role of either the novelist or the translator is to interpret and to give the readership the answer. So you have to leave that ambiguity. Of course, if you read the novel or flip through it, you'll see quickly political slogans. And slogans are in any language. First of all, they're hard to come up in your own language, right? People are paid to come up with slogans. They're certainly much more difficult to translate. Sometimes even difficult to understand the slogan. Remember, la ori, la ori, la ori es la candela. Thinking, what is the ori, what's the candela? And so, first you have to understand the context of the slogan. But then once you, and others are, it's very easy to understand, but